Douglas Murray, so-called Israel-Hamas-Ukraine war experts spew false info on Joe Rogan's podcast. There has to be a standard. There has to be a standard. Okay, let's see what Douglas Murray has to say. What is the standard? The Douglas Murray standard. Last week, I seemed to break the internet. I went back on the Joe Rogan podcast to talk about my new book on democracies and death cults, Israel and the future of civilization. Hold on. Is that the book title? Is that his title of his book? Israel and the future of civilization. Come on, brother, man. Come on. Relax a little bit with the glazing. Relax. Which is available on all good bookstores and Audible since you ask. I've been on Joe podcast a number of times before and have always enjoyed it. Joe is a master of his art. A lot of people think that they can talk casually but interestingly for hours. That's mainly because Joe makes it look so easy. But this time, I went on with a question. Having not spoken to Joe since the wars in Ukraine and Israel started, I had become increasingly irked that the guests that he had on had been almost entirely anti-Ukraine and anti-Israel. What? Hold on. Douglas Murray is a trip. So Douglas Murray is pro-Russia and pro-Israel. So he has a position that he feels like is justified for Russia to invade Ukraine or to, instigate this war in the first place. And he thinks over Crimea, I'm guessing. And he thinks it's entirely okay what Israel's done to Palestine in response to what happened on October 7th. This genocide that's occurring right in front of our eyes. Perfectly fine. They started it, we're finishing it. The Zionist way. Many of the latter, in particular, are just vindictively and maliciously anti-Israel, but have been spewing claims that are demonstrably false. Many are also people who are simply in no way an expert at what they're talking about. So you can only disagree with what Israel's doing if you're an expert. Okay, cool, got it. Attacks on Israel. One of these is a comedian who goes by the name of Dave Smith. I think he hates Dave Smith the most, to be honest. I'm not going to lie. I think Douglas Murray hates Dave Smith the most. Claiming some Jewish ancestry, he has spent 18 months since October 7, 2023 being very unfunny indeed. Specifically, he has decided to spend his time going around the podcast world sounding off about Israel. In the process, he largely cites people like him. People have been many views, but no obvious expertise. He cites himself. No, he doesn't, does he? That's crazy. He cites himself, okay? People like Daryl Cooper, who says he isn't a historian, yet he's been invited onto some of the world's biggest podcasts as a historian. One of Cooper's many ahistorical claims is Winston Churchill was the chief villain of World War II. To be fair, that's a crazy thing to put out there, right? The chief villain of World War II was Winston Churchill. Because what? That's a crazy take. I love it though. For originality, that's a crazy take. On these and many other occasions, Cooper has simply lied about history. When invited to debate the world's foremost living expert on Churchill last year, he declined, saying that he didn't know enough to go against such a figure. Yet still, Cooper gets invited on a show after show to throw out falsehoods that he can't even back up, and on which his online interviews seem happy not to challenge him. Another such figure from the world of comedy who is changing his shape to fit in time with Rogan is guest Ian Carroll. This is someone who, when he last went on Rogan podcast, very carefully tried to minimize the evil of Adolf Hitler. Outrageously and completely falsely, Carroll claimed that in the 1930s, Hitler had kept his anti-Semitism down. A provable false claim that Rogan did nothing to counter. All of these men have also been paling around online with Holocaust deniers and proud anti-Semites like Jake Shields. Well, even Jake Shields is getting a shot. Even Jake Shields. my bout on Rogan. 2 weeks ago, Rogan had his mate Dave Smith on yet again for a long podcast. But for my return on the show, the deal was that I could come on only if Dave Smith was on once again in the studio, as if Joe didn't want to be unaccompanied, or that Joe thought I was, of all his guests, who must be challenged. I like a debate as much as the next Scotsman, but what resulted was more of a debate. It seems to have led to some kind of podcast world meltdown. The first reason was that from the outset, I challenged Joe on his choice of guest and why he had been giving a platform to only one side of the debate, and very conspiratorial one at that. He and Smith were immediately defensive. But the real problem when I raised the issue of expertise, because as I said then and I've said often, we have lived through a period of experts that have gotten an awful lot of things wrong. From COVID lab leak to the Hunter Biden laptop, we have been through years after years of distrust of experts that become inevitable. Yet that doesn't mean that experts don't exist. Yet that doesn't mean that expertise does not exist. It does not mean that the comedian can simply hold himself out as a Middle East expert and should be listened to as if he has any body of work. It does not mean that someone who says that he is not a historian, who practices false history, should be cited as a historian. This point seemed to rile both Smith and Rogan. It appears to have riled their audiences even more, because many people seem to think that what I mean is that they are not allowed to have an opinion. Yeah, I think there is a lot of like triggering in it, right? Because there are some people, like Brendan Shaw with fucking true crime docs, there are some people who think that when they read or when they watch documentaries, or if they read a really long article, or they listen to a really long podcast, that they are somehow experts on that particular field, and that they then can take that information, share it amongst their friendship group, social group, and they can become the leading voice in that subject because they're the only person in that group who bother to listen to that 7-hour fucking hardcore history podcast and shit. But it doesn't mean you're an historian, Even fucking hardcore history guy, he doesn't even like to say he's a historian. So I think there is a need to call out people who speak from a point of authority, who really don't know what they're talking about. I think what Douglas Murray did was important. Although I don't agree with his stances and his worldviews and shit, I think it was important for Rogan and his friends to be reminded that not most people, there are some people out there that don't take them as seriously as they take themselves. And it's more than okay to point and laugh at what they have to say, ridicule them for what they have to say, ignore them on certain topics because they don't know what they're talking about. And that's perfectly okay. I think that's more than okay. But for those guys, it probably isn't, because they think if they speak about things long enough, especially on a podcast, then it means by default that they're experts, which obviously is not the case. It continues. It appears to have riled the audience even more, because many people think that what I meant is that if they're not allowed to have an opinion, that is wrong. I think they are. It's just that there should be a price to pay for spreading bullshit. The part of the price is that you should be called out. Yeah, that's true. I agree with that. Have you been there? If I had gone to Rogan's podcast and held myself out as an expert in MMA fighting, I suspect he would have noticed. Exactly. Good point. If I had kept making mistake after mistake and shown ignorance piled upon ignorance, I think he'd have said, hey, you don't seem to be very knowledgeable about this. And he'd be right. So why is it hard to grasp that something similar applies in other areas? He's making some good points here. In bigger rings, the more important fights. Having spent most of the 18 months in Israel and Gaza and Lebanon and Ukraine, I don't think I know everything. But I think I know a damn sight more than someone like Comic Smith. Yo, he hates Dave Smith. Douglas Murray hates Dave Smith. I love it. Having spent the last 18 months in Israel, Gaza, Lebanon and Ukraine, I don't think I know everything. But I think I know a darn sight more than someone like Comic Smith, who admitted he'd never been to the region he spends all his time talking about. Oh, so you've got to a country to comment on it, do you? Said part of the internet. Again, the answer is obviously not. But if it's your job, you're making it to your job, then probably yes. I agree with him there too. To be fair. You don't have to go, but if you're going to speak about these type of things, maybe going is quite an important part of the speaking of it, right? It's like talking about, I don't know, it's like professing that you love a certain band and you don't go to their shows, You don't have to go to their shows, but it's a bit weird, It's like talking about this band all the time, but you've never been to a single show. If I filled columns of this for this paper pretending to be an expert on countries I'd never been to, I would expect my readers to complain, as they should. If I filled columns about a war zone from a safety of a West Palm Beach, I think it would be a fraud. Journalism has had its own meltdown in recent years, but it doesn't mean that we don't have standards. Much though they might amaze some people, what standards are in the new media, especially on podcasts, is still being worked out, but there must be some. Otherwise, the new media will lead people into errors and evils far greater than the old media could ever dream of. I don't know. I think he's putting a little bit too much importance on this shit. No one really cares, to be honest. Like, nobody actually cares. I don't think so. The ones that do care, are they listening to Dave Smith, Douglas Murray, and Joe Rogan anyway, when it comes to issues pertaining to Lebanon, Gaza, Ukraine, and shit, and Russia? Probably not. They're going to go to the people who actually know what they're talking about, those type of things. I just think this is for the casuals like you and I, who are just like, dipping our toes here and there. But I think people who are really, well versed in these subjects, who maybe have some skin in the game because they're born in those countries, they have family from those countries, maybe they live there, they're probably listening to experts who know what they're talking about, as opposed to Rogan, Dave Smith, and Douglas Murray. But he did make some good points there. Good old Douglas Murray.